Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you all are from. And joining us today, welcome to the webinar titled Behind the Screen, Understanding and Addressing the Behavioral Health Impacts of Tech-Facilitated Abuse on Children and Youth. Please be advised that the Q&A and chat feature in Zoom have been disabled. However, should you experience any technical issues, please reach out to John Panetti, whose information has been placed in the chat. To get us started, I'd like to welcome Acting Assistant Secretary Andrew Gradison and our HHS Senior Advisor on Human Trafficking, Kevin Malone, to provide opening remarks. Assistant Secretary Gradison?
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. It's an honor to join you today. Technology-facilitated abuse is an urgent and growing public health concern. And it's not just for folks, as this has been a growing concern. I don't know who's read Jonathan Haidt's book, An Anxious Generation, but these concerns are growing and becoming more and more of a problem for every child today, especially as our lives are increasingly online. Exploiters are using the digital tools in increasingly harmful ways to target children and youth. And the scale of the problem is staggering. Last year alone, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received more than 20 million reports of suspected child sexual exploitation. Reports of online enticement jumped by nearly 200% in a single year. And AI-generated exploitation materials increased more than tenfold. These aren't just numbers and a digital world problem. They represent children and families threatened with real harm. The consequences are profound. Survivors face anxiety, depression, trauma, and isolation that can last a lifetime and ripple through families and communities. This is why behavioral health supports are so critical and why partnerships with providers like you are essential. At the Department of Health and Human Services, through our Make America Healthy Again initiative, we are working to prevent and address these harms head on. That means expanding prevention education, strengthening digital literacy, and building trauma-informed systems of care. It also means closing service gaps so survivors and their families can access timely behavioral health supports. The Trump administration has made this issue a top priority. Earlier this year, President Trump signed the Take It Down Act, championed by First Lady Melania Trump. This landmark legislation requires online platforms to remove non-consensual intimate images, including AI-generated deepfakes, upon notice. And this legislation represents a critical step forward to protect victims of digital exploitation. But legislation and federal action are not enough. We need collective, multi-sector responses. Families, schools, health and human services professionals, law enforcement, community leaders, faith-based organizations, our churches, and yes, technology companies all have a vital role to play. Together, we can create a safer digital environment so that our physical environments for children are safe, are improved, and we can ensure that our survivors get the supports that they need to thrive. I want to thank you for your commitment to this important issue and for all that you do on the front lines to protect our young people.
Thank you. Mr. Malone?
Thank you, Acting Assistant Secretary Gradison, and thank you to everyone joining us today. As you've just heard, the scope of technology-facilitated abuse is alarming, and the behavioral health impacts on children and youth are serious and long-lasting. Everywhere I go, every meeting I go into, I'm letting everyone know this is a national crisis facing our children. Survivors and their parents tell us about the fear, the shame, and the isolation they carry, and too often about the barriers they face in accessing care and peer support. For the past several months, we've been listening closely to a range of experts in this area. Earlier this month, we hosted a series of listening sessions with survivors, family members, service providers, and community partners. We've heard about the evolving abuse of technology from sextortion to financial sextortion to sadistic sextortion to other forms of abuse perpetrated not just by humans, but facilitated through AI and chatbots that young people engage with regularly. What we heard is shaping how we move forward, how we expand access to trauma-informed, survivor-centered services, and how we equip providers with the tools they need. Today's webinar is about sharing those insights and offering practical strategies for behavioral health professionals who are on the front lines. We can't do this alone. A strong collaborative response is essential, one that brings together families, caregivers, schools, health and human service professionals, law enforcement, faith organizations, and technology companies to prevent abuse, intervene early, and ensure survivors receive the support that they need. On behalf of HHS, I want to thank you for your expertise, your partnership, and your commitment. Together, we can disrupt harmful networks, support survivors, and strengthen resilience in children, families, and communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary Gradison and Mr. Malone. Without further delay, let's meet today's moderator and introduce the panelists. Catherine Chan will serve as the moderator of today's panel. Catherine is the Director of the Office on Trafficking in Persons at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Our panelists for today's discussion are licensed independent clinical social worker Ashley Guevara, Dr. Diana Freed, Dr. Kelly Kinish, and Dr. Morgan Pettyjohn. Ashley Guevara brings more than 18 years of professional experience working on commercial sexual exploitation of children and on behalf of CSEC involved youth in a variety of settings, including outpatient therapy, congregate care, court advocacy, and emergency services. Dr. Freed is an assistant professor in computer science and research focused on youth digital safety, security, privacy, health, and policy. Dr. Kinish has over 25 years experience working with maltreated and at-risk children and families in clinical, research, and administrative capacities, with a focus on child trafficking for the past 15 years. Dr. Pettyjohn is an assistant professor and researcher focused on the intersections of digital technologies with survivor experiences of victimization and help seeking. Over to you, Director Chan.
Great. Thank you so much to you, Samantha, to our colleagues over at the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center for organizing today's webinar. As you heard from our Acting Assistant Secretary Gradison and Kevin Malone, our Senior Advisor on Human Trafficking, this has been an issue we've been learning more about in terms of how it is impacting the health and well-being of children and families. But this webinar is a result of many calls to action that we've heard from individual survivors, parents, other caregivers, and also hearing directly from behavioral health professionals saying that they are wanting to have more information on what they can do to increase access to services, to connect with other communities in professional settings, and make sure that there are therapeutic models that are informed by how technology has been evolving in terms of creating harm and trauma for both individuals and families. We are honored to have so many subject matter experts join us today. I wanted to kick us off with a reminder of the learning objectives. This is a webinar for a professional community. There are 3 primary learning objectives of our time together, and our hope is that by the end of this webinar that you will feel that you've made progress in the pathway of these learning objectives. The first one is to understand the impact of technology facilitated abuses and how it's contributing to unique psychological, emotional, behavioral, and other social impacts, particularly on children and youth. Today, we're really going to focus on children and youth, and then in future settings, we'll bring in more of perspectives on services and needs of adult populations. The second learning objective is to examine effective behavioral health interventions and assess opportunities to integrate digital literacy and safety strategies into clinical practices. And the third learning objective is to analyze case scenarios, so case studies that reflect real world complexities, and how to apply different assessment strategies, examine an individual's unique needs, and develop a tailored multidisciplinary response plan. Here at HHS, we've heard very much directly from survivors, from parents, not just of need for clinical or supporting clinical settings, but even the peer-to-peer support. So hopefully some of those good practices will be surfacing through our conversation today. So with that, just kicking off first with Diana, I'm going to turn to you. And can you share with us what are you currently noticing in your work related to tech facilitated abuse involving children and youth?
Thank you for that question. So, tech facilitated abuse can take many forms. Let me share some examples. There's image based sexual abuse called IBSA, which is the non consensual creation, distribution, or threat of distribution of explicit images and/or videos. And IBSA also includes deepfakes or synthetic images, which is when AI is used to create an explicit image, video, or audio of someone without consent. And sextortion is a combination of the words sex and extortion. It is a non physical form of coercion where a perpetrator threatens to send out someone's private or sensitive materials or pictures if they do not provide them with more sexual images, sexual favors, or money. Additionally, technology facilitated violence is the misuse or manipulation of technology to commit any harmful threat or act directed at an individual or group. And in my current research, I find that technology facilitated abuse involving children and youth is growing both in complexity and the ways it evades detection and intervention. Two linked characteristics stand out that I'd like to share. One is that harm is distributed across multiple platforms and communication modes, and attackers deliberately escalate interactions beginning on visible mainstream social media platforms and then migrate to perceived private digital spaces like Discord servers, encrypted messengers, ephemeral apps to consolidate control and avoid adult oversight. Additionally, we're seeing more incidents that originate among peers or acquaintances, and these cases often involve explicit content, such as using personal and private photos, videos, and messages for revenge, and can escalate into coercion or financial extortion. And this may include manipulation or digital actions to prove loyalty, using shared location settings or Find My Phone to track or control whereabouts in youth relationships or peer groups, forcing access to financial accounts or requiring payment for or to someone else.
Ashley, in your work, working directly with children and youth, what are you seeing?
Thank you. Yeah, the landscape is really constantly changing. So we try to stay ahead of the latest apps and platforms and themes and trends, but we also recognize that the technology is often moving faster than we are. Um, so in the realm of direct care and training of direct care staff, a lot of our efforts are really focused on helping providers make connections between the skills and tools they already have and how those skills and tools may need to be adapted to apply to situations involving technology facilitated abuse, even as the specific details might shift and change.
Thank you, Diana. I'm going to turn it back to you because we want to start with kind of grounding in the research and data in terms of what we're grappling with. So where do you see intersections where you consider tech facilitated abuse, other forms of abuse experienced by children and youth, and strategies that are used to induce or coerce or control young people in these digital spaces?
So, perpetrators actively target young people who may be sharing through social media their difficult life experiences or who may be seeking connection. These may include, but are not limited to, eating disorders, family conflict, loneliness, or bullying. And perpetrators typically initiate contact by mirroring interests or posing as peers or local students, sometimes using convincing or stolen photos to enhance credibility. Grooming and coercion we're seeing usually unfold over weeks or a few months, not as a single interaction. While trust is gradually built through flattery, shared confidences, and small boundary testing requests until the young person is pressured for explicit material. In online network cases, for example, groups like the 764 network, this escalation can include demands that the youth harm themselves or produce explicit video content with group-based dynamics used to amplify shame and compliance. And perpetrators will engage youth and continually ask for more, and they'll push as far as they can. They will psychologically groom and manipulate young people either through coercion and threats of harm or pretending to befriend or even have a romantic interest in the young person.
And just for the benefit of people on the call who may not be familiar with 764, Dr. Freed had mentioned those in her remarks. These are uh, well, online. They could be hybrid communities, online communities where young people are coerced over time to inflict harm on themselves or harm on pets or do other harmful actions under threat and coercion. And what we've been hearing from our federal law enforcement colleagues is what started off with a small cluster of these online groups impacting young people are now in the hundreds all across the United States. And we work with school districts all the time in terms of funding prevention education, and we're hearing from them directly of concerns linked to these types of uh, harmful online networks. So thank you, Diana, for that. Morgan, I'm going to turn to you for some additional research that you and your team have been involved in. Could you add a little bit more to help us understand how these various forms of abuse intersect?
Yeah, so building on some of the points that Diana made in terms of perpetrators targeting young people who are sharing difficult experiences online, my team has done research specifically looking at the intersections of technology use and childhood abuse or neglect. We surveyed 641 young adults across the United States and found that among those who experienced abuse or neglect in childhood, 56%, so over half, had disclosed these experiences on social media. And when we asked them what motivated them to do this in follow-up interviews, they described that their devices were one of their only sources of connection and support, particularly if they were concerned about mandatory reporting requirements if they were to seek help from offline sources. And it's important to note that in our body of work, in this area, we've found that children disclosing abuse on social media spaces, they often receive positive responses from their peers, and at times even life-saving support if they're dealing with intense violence at home or suicidal ideation. However, while our research indicates ways that social media can serve as a protective factor for some youth, unfortunately, we know that children experiencing offline vulnerabilities, like abuse in their homes, are at a higher risk of grooming and exploitation in online spaces. So I brought a quote that I wanted to share with you all from one of our research participants who was explaining why they turned to social media in the midst of abuse they were experiencing at home. And they said, it's a place where other people like me who want attention and want to feel validated and wanted a place to talk about it in sort of a low stakes situation, we all come together in this place. So consider the vulnerabilities that could be exploited as a young person is sharing these accounts to friends or to strangers online. And while Diana and I have each mentioned increased risk factors for children who experience offline adversities, it's important to recognize that all youth have unique risk because of their developmental stage. They often have unfettered access to technology, and adults in their life who may not be up to date on the latest platforms and trends. Youth are using online platforms as third spaces to do all types of things like explore their identities, develop a sense of self, and to interact with others. And so I bring up all of these points to hopefully add some nuance to the conversation and inform your assessment and intervention work with teens. First of all, if you know that a child is experiencing tech abuse or simply has really high levels of tech use, like they always feel like they have to be on their phone or they want to get on their device as soon as they get home from school, it's worth doing a holistic assessment about their home lives to understand if there's a reason they feel really reliant on these devices for support or distraction. And then a second point I'd like to emphasize is that while cutting teens off from tech completely may keep them safe from online harm, our work suggests that this could, in some instances, inadvertently worsen the impacts of some forms of offline harm that they're experiencing at home or in communities. So, as always, a balanced intervention approach is warranted.
Thank you, Morgan. So we're going to start diving more into the clinical practices of what this could look like. And I want to start off with partly what prompted us to ask our colleagues over at NITAC to organize this webinar. Kevin and I, we were mentioning we were hearing from many survivors and their parents, and one parent who is very familiar with clinical practices and behavioral health services noticed that her child had cuts on her various parts of her body and was referred to a behavioral health provider who created a treatment plan that's very familiar with the many behavioral health professionals on this call. And quickly, maybe not quickly, over time, it became apparent that whatever the treatment response was not working in her child's particular, in her daughter's case. And it wasn't until much later that they realized that the cutting was not due to self-harm in some of the textbook cases of how behavioral health professionals are trained. And no one had fully realized that she was induced to cut through these, in this case, like a 764 type online group. And that additional understanding of the technology facilitated abuse then helped to create a different pathway for how the family was connected to services. And so really understanding the technology piece and how it's evolved is part of our learning objectives here. So Kelly, I'm going to turn it to you. If you can help us start diving into what are the potential psychological, behavioral, and short long-term impacts that providers should be aware of. What factors should providers understand that can influence how they're assessing the impact of potential tech-facilitated abuses?
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. I mean, just like there's so many ways that tech facilitated abuse occurs, there are different ways that children and youth are impacted and different ways that they come to cope with their experiences. We can see a pretty wide range of emotional and behavioral responses, but I think especially common anxiety, worries, problems with emotional regulation, especially when something is maybe reminding them of what's happened. This could be something that they see or hear, or often something someone says to them that's upsetting. Withdrawal and isolation from peers and family can be especially prominent as well. Some youth can have really deeply troubling shame and guilt, thoughts they can't shake, especially about having been betrayed by someone they thought they could trust, about what others may know about what's happened, how this might change, how others are viewing them. Maybe not knowing who may have access may have access now or may someday have access to images. Thoughts like everybody knows what happens, my two parents will never trust me, I'll never know who's seen my pictures. These can be really upsetting thoughts for youth to carry around. And I think, especially troubling, I think these thoughts can settle in as core beliefs and have deeper impacts on identity and self-concept and relationships, carrying around ideas, I'm bad, I'm stupid, people are always going to hurt me and take advantage of me, no one can be trusted. These can really be carried around and have longer term implications. And unfortunately, some of the things that can contribute to vulnerability to facilitated abuse, like some of the others we're sharing, things like loneliness, isolation, maybe difficulties with social skills and peer interactions, are then made worse in the aftermath of tech facilitated abuse. It's also true, and I think your example is what you shared earlier. Sometimes the youth's best efforts to cope with what's happening also result in harm. So this can be substance use, or in the example, engaging in non-suicidal self-injury. Long term, I think if these things aren't addressed, there can be diagnoses of post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression.
Kelly, can you dive a little bit deeper in terms of if these are the potential range of impacts, short and long term, are there certain factors that family members, behavioral health professionals should be aware of that exacerbate and lead to like some of the more severe impacts?
Yeah, absolutely. They don't, in many ways, differ substantially from what makes a difference with regard to non-tech facilitated abuse. So I think we're still looking at things like the specific nature of the harm, the specific acts of abuse that occur, even as tech facilitated, this part of the relationship with the offender or exploiter, the dimension of betrayal by someone that they thought they could trust, I think is still especially prominent, whether it's online or not. But when this has happened in a tech facilitated way, we can draw on that kind of knowledge, experience, and understanding. How do we help youth and help families? Especially important, the response of others to disclosure or discovery. This is, how do parents respond? How do peers react? If law enforcement involved, and how that goes, what happens with regard to, how school personnel handle this when it's something that's happening in the school environment, are really, really important indicators of how the youth and the family are gonna deal with this. This can be like, what may be said specifically to the youth when first learning about it, what's said about the youth to other folks, also considering what other changes or kind of quote consequences there might be to the youth to disclosure or discovery. So, what that means when the thing that happens is limited or denied access to social media, maybe having their peer interactions restricted because of what's happened. Sometimes it's really not very welcome systems involvement, experiences of perceived public shame and humiliation. There can be things like either actual or worried about or perceived changes in how the caregiver views the child. Sometimes, kids and sometimes other folks think a best thing that can happen is changing schools, but that has implications as well. And sometimes youth can be really upset by conflict that they're observing between their parents that they know is about what's happened to them. So these are all things that can kind of feature in how a youth is impacted by these experiences. I really, in all of this, want to understand the importance of assessment and case conceptualization. It's so important that we understand, and I think what you shared is such a great example. How we are learning to understand what's happening, the meaning that youth is making of what's happening. We have to listen, not make assumptions. Really understand what's driving the concerning behavior, whether the concerning behavior is the tech and social media use, or their efforts to cope with what might be happening to them that is harmful and concerning. I guess the last thing I'd say, it's important to realize that youth at different ages have different concerns, reactions, and impacts. So a younger child may be less concerned about images that are being shared with others, especially if they don't know them, whereas a teenager might be really super troubled by that. And that we recognize that a youth's concerns about these things might change over time. So what might be going on for a youth when they're younger, as they kind of go into adolescence and have a broader kind of understanding of the context, they might have different things that they need to work through and process in therapy.
Kelly, can you kind of paint a picture, just give an example, a scenario of what this could look like?
Yeah, I'd love to, thanks. So here's a little bit of that to draw on. So Alexis had a crush on a college student who was an assistant coach for the tennis team in her high school. They began communicating over social media. Eventually she shared images of herself, and later the coach videotaped them having sex. One day Alexis was approached by several classmates who had these images and videos on their phone. Several of the youth threatened to share the images with Alexis' parents and the school administrator if she did not agree to their demands. Alexis begins to distance herself from her friends and shares with her parents the desire to quit the tennis team. Her parents observe a decline in her appetite and that she seems to become particularly jumpy when the phone rings or alerts come through. Alexis's mom accidentally walks in on her as she's getting dressed and notices several cuts on her forearms. The family contacts you to schedule an intake appointment to explore therapeutic services. And I will say, although there is a self-injury dimension of this, as to what Catherine just shared, this is not actually the same situation, same circumstance that she had described earlier. So I think, so one thing, one consideration here is what might be some first steps to consider, like what might engagement with Alex look like, or what might be some things to really kind of focus on in terms of initial engagement with Alex. And I think here engagement is really going to hinge on, and this is some of our kind of clinical bread and butter, but it's really going to be first about establishing safety and trust, both physical and psychological safety. As I mentioned earlier, like how we are communicating or over communicating our non-judgment, not making assumptions. Really important, I think, normalizing and validating their feelings and experiences, and especially reducing the sense of isolation, and importantly, enhancing hope. I think sometimes, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but sort of like, youth can sometimes feel sort of really trapped and like there's really no way out of these situations. And probably the first thing we have to do is really kind of give them a sense of there is a pathway out of this. But I think the thing here is it's often less about doing something different or extra. And in some of these circumstances, to get started in like the best possible way, it's really going to be about being really excellent at our core clinical skills. There may be less of something particularly important, different, and just we have to be so great at these first kind of foundational kind of parts of interacting with youth. I think a next thing to kind of consider is like what might be some of the kind of upsetting thoughts that Alex might be having. And in this scenario, I think the thing I'm most worried about is that her sense of maybe feeling trapped and hopeless. I don't know how to get out of this. There's no way out, especially concerning. I think she's also maybe, we can expect her to be worried about who else may know or find out. And often this assumption, everybody knows. I don't know who might have these pics. I think sometimes there's this concern is, what if some other important person to them, a friend, a teacher, or romantic interest might have that? And I think those can be kind of really deeply troubling kind of thoughts to work through. And I would suspect lots of thoughts about betrayal by her coach, especially when the person is maybe in a position where there's more of an understanding or expectation of care, and a bit more of maybe a violation of the social contract. I think the other, another kind of point of emphasis in this scenario is what might be going on for Alex's parents and what they need. And they're going to need pretty much everything that Alex would need from a therapeutic intervention, and maybe even more. They're going to need a place to work through their feelings and work together to determine how to best support Alex. Parents, understandable. I would say it is understandable. Their first thoughts and reactions can be things like, what were you thinking? But that's often like not what's going to be most helpful for their children. There's just so much of their own shame, sometimes even disgust, confusion, uncertainty, and fear that can be really overwhelming for caregivers. So sometimes I think the best things that we can do for a youth is all of the ways that we might help to support the caregiver and really guide and coach the caregiver on how to best support them. It's often true that their initial reactions may not have included their best, most supportive statements. So they may need some time to do some repair. And again, I think there's so much value in really working through even role playing, how to help formulate kind of authentic, supportive messaging to their child. Something in the realm of, we're upset because we care about you and we're in this together. So we're acknowledging that this has happened, but really kind of, and I said, sometimes the role playing is really helpful, I think, to give them an opportunity to, safe and supported and separate from the youth, to be able to kind of share their feelings, and also come back around to what's going to be the most important things to say to the youth to provide our best support to them. And I guess to kind of reiterate, like, again, factors that might help in this case, like her willingness or ability to kind of disclose more. As I said, and as others have and will, I think the shame, fear of judgment, isolation and rejection that they may already be feeling and now worrying about more. There may be fears of retaliation, not wanting more people to know, not wanting more harm to come to their abuser, as will be unpacked a little bit more later. And just sometimes the unknown, not knowing what will happen. Can be some things that really can make it difficult for a youth to be able to share with what we hope would be trusting, safe, and supportive adults. But again, as I mentioned earlier, sort of the thing that we want to get to sort of counteract some of that is everything that we're doing around safety, establishing trust, showing respect, over communicating non-judgment, providing information around some of these issues to empower the youth, everything that we're doing to reduce isolation, and that part about establishing hope.
Thank you, Kelly. In our listening session so far, we hear from so many parents how hard it was initially for them to even start seeking out services. Sometimes it's easier to seek out services for their child, but even with that, it's kind of they feel so much guilt and blame and shame of why, how this could have happened under their watch. And I think for many of the behavioral health professionals, what I'm hearing is that it's not just the individual child or young person who was experiencing the harm, but how to support parents, caregivers, and then for any behavioral health professionals working in an education setting or a faith-based setting at an institutional level, it really does, like, there is a need for broader community support. So like how to help educators and school administrators or other young people to be part of the healing journey, because it's not just impacting one person. So thank you for that. So Maureen, I'm going to turn to you on, we've talked a little bit about the intersections of online and offline abuses, and there's some overlap, some unique factors. Do you have any recommendations on how behavioral health service providers can assess for technology facilitated abuse? Like, when do they do it? How do they do it? Any recommendations?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, at this point in society where we're at with tech and how quickly it's evolving, universal assessment and psychoeducation about tech safety for both parents and kids, really regardless of what the presenting problem is ideal. And it's important that any resource materials you use are current, are evidence-based, and that they're bringing in the voices of young people. Um, Tying back to some of the points that I made earlier, I also really appreciate materials that take a balanced approach to youth's online behavior. So, recognizing both the very real and serious harms that can happen, as well as potential benefits. You're much more likely to experience resistance from youth in making healthy changes to their online behaviors if you go in with an attitude that tech is, universally negative and harmful. Um, so when I'm working with a family system and initially learning about their sort of broader dynamics during initial assessments, I like to open the door to conversations about tech abuse and just tech use with questions like, how does each family member spend their time while they're at home? What types of devices does each member own, and what types of things do you each like to do online? And what this does is allows you to start mapping the digital behaviors of family members to identify areas where you may need to go deeper. And importantly, it signals to the family that tech is an important thing for them to be thinking about with regards to their child's health, safety, and well being. So, based on however youth respond to what devices they have access to and what they like doing online, you can follow up with questions like, do your parents have any rules about your phone or your social media use? Who do you like to talk to and hang out online or through your device? And these questions can give you more context to the level of oversight that parents have or may not have on their children's tech use, and provide you with useful information about why certain devices and platforms may be important to that youth that you're working with based on what they like doing and who it is that they're connecting with. And I'm a couple and family therapist myself, so I'm a very like systems oriented thinker. Anytime you're supporting a young person and their tech use, it's important to consider a whole family approach because we know that family involvement often leads to longer lasting positive outcomes. Um, at the same time, young people, especially adolescents, may feel more comfortable sharing sensitive thoughts or experiences when given the space to speak privately with a behavioral health professional. Um, and of course, this depends on the state that you're practicing in. Laws regarding minor consent and confidentiality differ, and you should all, we are all familiar with our state's specific guidelines. But the goal, in essence, is to balance respect for the youth's confidentiality with efforts to engage parents or caregivers in a way that supports the child's overall well being. So, in these cases, clinicians can help serve as a bridge between the youth and their family, fostering that communication and hopefully building trust over time. Um, and if you're ever having to navigate this conversation with parents, it may be helpful to explain to them that offering their child some space to talk with you one on one does not mean excluding them, but rather it creates an opportunity for their child to hopefully be more open, which will ultimately hopefully strengthen the parent child relationship and support your overall treatment goals.
Thanks, Morgan. Can you walk us through a case scenario in terms of doing this type of assessment in a clinical setting?
Sure. Yeah, so here's a very brief case scenario on the screen. You are referred a case with a 15-year-old boy for behavioral issues in school, namely skipping class, marijuana use, and regularly being on his phone, despite school policy that no cell phones are allowed. And you hear that when the school resource officer asks where the student obtained the marijuana, he just said some dude on Discord. And so, in terms of beginning to assess for potential tech abuse in situations like this, where there seems to be a high level of tech use that's disrupting other areas of a young person's life, and there's, of course, other concerning behaviors happening. I would again start with kind of the basic questions of what do you like doing on your phone? What's drawing you to it all day long throughout school? Do your parents have any rules for you about your phone or internet use? And then beyond these baseline questions, I would ask things like, tell me about things you do online that make you feel really happy and excited. And I like to start with that type of question. I find it useful to start by acknowledging that there are certainly fun things to do online and that you understand why youth may want to engage in them. I find that this can help kind of soften their defenses and possibly want to share with you, what it is that they enjoy doing. And then you could follow up at some point with that, with the question of, have you ever had an experience kind of on the other side of things when something online was upsetting or made you feel bad? And what I like about this type of question is it can prompt the youth to identify times when they haven't felt good after online interactions and help them build skills to start identifying harm rather than adults telling them what isn't and isn't harmful. Um, Obviously, general psychoeducation about tech abuse is important. Like, we need to be teaching young people what's safe, what's not safe, what's healthy and unhealthy. But again, especially with teens, this can really trigger resistance because they're seeking that independence and they often don't want to be told by adults what to do or how to feel. So bringing them into that conversation by treating them as experts in their own feelings and experiences can be helpful. Some other questions that I might ask could be, do you like to talk about what you do online with your parents, or does it feel hard to talk to them about those things? I have seen in my work that, a lot of youth state that their parents have no rules really about phones or social media use or internet use. And usually that signals a lack of monitoring or oversight at home, which can increase risk of tech abuse victimization. Um, Again, based on developmental level and the desire for increasing independence, many youth won't willingly want to talk to their parents about what they're doing online. But if they don't feel like they have an open dialogue, um, not only does it increase risk of abuse happening, but it also increases risk of, if they do experience something harmful, they may not seek out help or support from their parents when it really is needed. Another question that I like to ask is, uh, do you ever talk to people on the internet when you're having a hard time at home, or maybe if you're fighting with your parents or your friends? Do you know these people in person, or where did you meet them online? Because as we've discussed, teens who turn to social media for connection or support, um, that can be beneficial in some circumstances, but if they are turning to strangers in particular to help deal with personal difficulties, um, that can again increase their risk of victimization. And tying back to this case scenario, in terms of kind of my assessment of the youth's level of risk for tech abuse, um, it would be first of all shaped by this youth's answer to some of the questions that I just talked through about their positive and negative experiences they've had online and their level of communication and perceptions of safety that they have with their parents. But beyond these points, the scenario implies that this child may be talking with someone that he doesn't know in real life on Discord. And not only that, but they also are getting drugs from this person, which could provide additional opportunities for exploitation in exchange for the substances, or in exchange for keeping quiet that the child is using the substances, like demanding them to send explicit photos or demanding the performance of sexual acts, things like that. So after doing an initial assessment and joining with this client, I would try to actively engage the youth in trying to minimize their own risk of harm by saying, let's talk about some strategies to stay safe online so that you can continue having fun and getting support from your friends and playing the games you like to, or whatever it may be, without worrying about someone hurting you or putting you in a situation that you're not comfortable with. And kind of from this conversation, some basic safety strategies that I would recommend would be reviewing all of this youth's social media privacy settings, especially location settings within social media platforms, as well as the location metadata of the photos that they're taking on their phone, because this ensures that if they send someone a picture, the other person won't be able to see the exact location of where it was taken. I would also recommend and remind this youth of the importance of only posting personal identifying information on platforms where they know their friends in person, and limiting or anonymizing interactions in other spaces where strangers may be present.
Great. Thank you, Morgan. There are so many like little follow-up streams of questions that I have, and in doing this work and being a parent, uh, I have asked subject matter experts in this field, in the tech field, and the number one thing that they talk about is early and frequent trusted communications with parents. Like, we don't need to be the experts on how to change all the settings on like dozens of platforms. And yes, making it easier for parents and consumers of technology would be very helpful, but really the underlying foundation is having that open channel of communication so that if something is happening, that the young person in your life, whether you're a parent, caregiver, educator, some other trusted adult will be like, oh, this weird thing happened. What do you think? Versus, oh, this weird thing happened. I can't say this to anyone because then like I'll get in trouble or the tech
Mhm.
will be taken away or something along those lines. Thank you for sharing that. So, as we dig a little bit more into these, like as we want to provide as many practical tools, tactics, strategies for the population on the participants on the call. Morgan, I think you got us off to a good start with some of these very concrete questions, and for participants, we'll get the sample questions out in case it is helpful, and this is also being recorded. But Ashley, turning to you, when we're thinking specifically about the uh, the facilitation of technology-related abuse, can you go into a little bit more detail in terms of what might impact whether a child or young person engages in having these types of conversations, feels safe in disclosing, and what strategies could a provider use to navigate pretty sensitive conversations?
Yeah, thank you. I think youth need to feel like they're not going to be shamed, right, for the experiences that they've had online, the abusive experiences they've had. And so much of the education that we do about online safety is based in what not to do. Right? So don't send pictures, don't use this app, don't meet up with anyone in person who you don't know online. Or excuse me, who you only know online. And these safety rules exist for a reason, but youth need to know that help's going to be available no matter what. And if you feel some shame as though they participated in some way or guilt, I feel like they deserve what happened, right? If we, depending on how we respond. So the response is important in validating that the youth just shared some really difficult information with a trusted adult. It should be rewarded regardless of the minor's actions, regardless of their missteps. And we want to coach parents to do the same thing. So saying things like, I'm so glad you told me, you're brave for sharing that. That must have been really hard, can be really helpful. Um, as we mentioned previously, youth may also be experiencing threats from a perpetrator. So threats of harm, threats to disclose information that youth wants kept private, threats to disseminate explicit imagery. And this could be particularly difficult when the young person cares about the person to some degree who caused them that harm. So they may also be experiencing some grief over the realization that someone who may have initially presented themselves as a trusting adult, a friend, a partner, was actually targeting them. So they may be in denial, about believing that the perpetrator never meant any of the things that they said while they were being groomed, the things they were promised. The youth may still believe that the perpetrator was genuine. And although the young person may want the harm to stop, they don't sometimes want the perpetrator to get into trouble. And so, whether it's due to fear or shame or guilt or desire to protect the perpetrator, kids may be hesitant to disclose. Rather than continuing to push for disclosure, providers want to work on building trust and safety, and focusing on providing strategies for coping and for emotional regulation. So we want to validate the youth's feelings, reactions, potential trauma responses, telling them it makes sense that you might feel that way, right? Normalizing that. Um, be mindful of the youth's relationship with their abuser, and in situations where the youth might feel protective of their abuser, be really mindful about how you communicate about the perpetrator. So overemphasizing that the perpetrator is a bad person, for example, might hinder their engagement, or their further willingness to discuss what's happening, especially in the early stages of treatment. So saying things maybe more like, you feel like no one understands, so and so, your perpetrator, though no one understands your relationship with them, right? So validating that feeling. Um, Avoid asking why, because sometimes why questions can be interpreted as blaming or shaming. So instead, something like, tell me more about what felt good about messaging with this person, instead of why were you messaging this person. Use reflective statements to validate the young person and show them that you're listening, that you hear them. You felt excited about getting to know this person. It was hurtful that they betrayed you. Engage the youth in activities around self-exploration, so supporting the development of their identity and their interests. and reinforcing the ability and creating a space for young people to feel like they have the opportunity to make decisions. You're a good advocate for yourself. You know yourself really well.
Thanks, Ashley. So then turning it back to Kelly in a clinical setting, can you describe some therapeutic interventions that you found effective in supporting children and youth in their healing journey, if they've experienced technology facilitated abuse? And are there ways you would adapt different types of services to young people who've experienced tech facilitated abuse versus abuse, like not necessarily technology related?
Yeah, thank you. And Ashley made such great points that I think kind of really feed into this nicely in terms of some of the dimensions of the relationship in particular and how youth are experiencing this. But again, I think recognizing that there are features of tech facilitated abuse and some of the things that are most impactful in terms of how youth experience it and what the potential long-term and short-term impacts are. The fact that there are so many of these shared features with other clinical challenges, especially related to trauma and non-tech facilitated abuse. The helpful thing here is we already have these really great existing evidence-based treatments and strategies that are also then helpful in addressing the needs of individuals and families who have experienced tech facilitated. So again, we really need to kind of go with some of our core strategies for addressing safety, accessing helpful knowledge to better understand their experiences and responses. What needs to happen in terms of building skills, coping and relationship social skills. And then what are we doing to kind of help them to make meaning of the experiences that they've had? So that being said, yes, there are in many ways the kind of our approaches generally to use have really helpful applications here. There are probably some tech facilitated specificity, I think, especially in safety, and my colleagues on the panel are addressing that so well. What might be especially helpful in terms of what are the psychoeducation topics that are important to include? What might be some of those tech specific trauma reminders that might be impacting youth in their everyday lives? And then upsetting thoughts that are specifically related to features of the tech facilitated abuse, like the image sharing, like the nature of deception and manipulation that happens online that might be different than how that happens in terms of our kind of non-tech facilitated abuse. Again, it's not that deception and manipulation doesn't happen, but there can be dimensions of it that are different than non-tech facilitated. So, again, important potential helpful elements, and these often can cross-cut whatever might be a person's particular kind of treatment approach. But I think what I want people to hear is it is important that we are still using these things. These elements are still incredibly important to ensure that we're including in our work with tech facilitated abuse, youth and families. And again, we're going to hear this over and over, that establishing physical and psychological safety is always going to be our first priority in our treatment approaches. Are there immediate safety concerns or concerns related for safety in the long term? Incorporate safety planning, and colleagues have really great guidance and resources on that, and so I'm not going to speak too much about that. Again, the importance of providing information and knowledge to inform and empower youth. So this is the source material for normalizing and validating their experiences, and Ashley kind of referenced the importance of that, helping them better understand for themselves what they're going through and experiencing. Reducing their kind of feelings of isolation, that they're the only one dealing with something like this. And again, the importance of addressing healthy relationships and decision-making generally, and then its applications for social media use. So topics that are important for safer use of technology, as previously mentioned by Morgan and Diane. Yeah, skills building, especially to enhance regulatory capacity. So that's coping with upsetting things that have happened, things that may be happening to remind their use of their abuse and exploitation. Enhancing the social and communication skills, especially if that's been a contributor to their vulnerability to abuse. We really want to continue to really ramp that up. It's only going to become a bit more challenging, I think, in the context of this. Ashley addresses that really well as well. In specific situations, when distress related to specific reminders of the abuse is resulting in avoidance that's interfering with functioning, like not going to school, for example, or other kind of aspects of technology in their everyday lives are kind of causing some reminders and some dysregulation. There may be some situations when some gradual exposure or systematic desensitization can be helpful, especially if that's something that's kind of in your toolbox, or you can get some support in doing that well with youth and family. The cognitive processing and meaning making. So the broader meaning making to kind of put it in the context of their whole life is, I think, going to be really important. And yes, as part of that is probably going to be addressing some inaccurate or unhelpful thoughts, being especially important. So helping them to develop more balanced thoughts. So maybe about themselves, from I'm ruined, I can't trust myself, to yeah, I'm dealing with some difficult stuff, but I'm learning things that are going to help me in the future. Maybe how they're kind of thinking about others. I can't trust anyone, or I've had, can we kind of shift that to something that's more balanced? Like, I've had someone violate my trust, but I'm learning about boundaries of trust to help me in the future. And sometimes I think in this area, some of the hardest ones are thoughts that are accurate, but still unhelpful. So I can never know who's seen pictures of me. Like, that's an act, that's not a distortion. That's like a fact, right? So, but how can we have them think about it in a more balanced and helpful way? Something along the lines of, I can't know who may see the images, but law enforcement is working to take them down, and people I care about are going to know me for who I am, not for those images. Things like that we really want to kind of help youth to take on. As I mentioned before, the work with the care and other people that I like this really strong messaging around the importance of working with caregivers, providing information to them, just as we are to the youth, helping them to be better regulated for themselves and interactions with their child, and also better regulated sometimes with other professionals. Caregivers have their own upsetting thoughts and beliefs that impact how they're interacting with their child and others, and we can help them with that. They might also need some guidance around some basic behavioral management. Sometimes in these contexts, parents can really kind of lose their footing on how do I parent effectively in this really difficult time. So I think it's a way that I think therapists can really kind of step up and help provide some help. I think this has been pointed out, but in that realm, I guess, of behavior management, not effective necessarily to push them to this, all of the ways that we can guide parents to focus on healthy engagement activities with help and help seeking, less this idea of like total lockdown on their tech access.
Ashley, would you want to add any particular modalities or other thoughts to what Kelly shared?
Yeah, sure. So I can speak to sort of their components from many different modalities that can be applicable when we're serving youth who might have experienced tech facilitated abuse. So for example, ACRA, right, the Adolescent Community Reinforcement Approach. We talk about finding pro-social community activities for young people. And my experience has been that many of the youth who are exploited online were initially seeking some kind of connection or community. So talking with them about other ways for them to find that kind of support and community can be an important strategy for preventing further exploitation. The Child and Family Traumatic Stress Intervention, or CFTSI, focuses on the child caregiver relationship and how to help families find some shared language around their child's trauma. And I found that caregivers can be especially challenged by trying to understand kids' online behavior and online experiences. So finding a way for young people and their parents to feel more comfortable talking about what happened, talking about the trauma, helping parents develop some empathy for understanding why, for example, their child may have shared those images, right, can decrease some of the shame and increase the connection between them, both of which, right, we know are essential components of healing from trauma. The trauma screenings that we use in several of these modalities, like CFTSI or trauma-focused CBT, can help put the youth's trauma into context and understanding past life events and other circumstances that might have played a role in their vulnerability or their experience. These assessments also provide us with helpful information about the ways the trauma manifests for this child and give us some guidance on where to focus when we're engaging in clinical work. A practice like EMDR, so eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, can help a young person identify some of the specific feelings that arise when they think about their trauma, connect that with other situations or other times that they might have felt that way before, and work to resolve some of those trauma symptoms that they are experiencing as a result of that. And in any of these interventions, it's essential to spend some time identifying and building up coping mechanism and strategies, right, before we dive deeper into the work, just as we would when treating any other type of trauma, right? So considering activities that can calm and regulate the brain's trauma response, right, that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, before we engage in any talk or activities that require the use of that thinking brain, right? So examples like focused breathing, mindfulness activities, yoga, blowing bubbles, some body-based, more somatic activities, prayer or positive affirmation, building up emotional vocabulary and ability to self-express, sometimes play or sensory-based activities. There isn't one gold standard or one treatment modality, right, for working with tech-facilitated abuse. And regardless of what modality a clinician's using, there is an opportunity to address the vulnerabilities in the child caregiver relationship. These may have existed before the abuse began, right? And they may have been a risk factor in that abuse. And we know that the caregiver's support is going to be a really important future protective factor. So, for example, if the caregiver relationship is not safe, are there other adults that in the future might be able to support that youth? Our role as providers is to try to develop a really tailored multidisciplinary treatment plan. And our time with the child is really limited, right? So we have to pretty quickly determine how we increase other protective factors. And that can include working with the young person to identify other trusted adults, right? Teachers, coaches, community members, using a really holistic, whole person approach to identify, where the youth have existing connections in place already, right? And where to build positive connections as part of that treatment process.
Thanks, Ashley. I hope in addition to clinical practitioners on this call, we have parents and teachers, educators, coaches, others who are seeking to strengthen our own capacity to respond to the needs of young people in this digital age. So we focused for the last several minutes really on the clinical services and care, but earlier on during this webinar, there were references to safety planning and digital safety planning. Ashley, can you kind of kick us off of what this has looked like in youth service settings?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that most of the safety planning that I do will fit into two categories. There are the strategies that I'm working with parents or caregivers, and the strategies for doing some of the direct education with the young people. So in terms of with the parents in particular, or the caregivers, talk early and talk often. A lot of times kids have experienced more online than we expect them to have experienced, and a lot earlier than we expect them to have experienced it. Um, we talked about this earlier, but really avoiding the expectation that kids are just going to simply disconnect and sign offline, right? That can really shut down the conversations, and young people are not going to bring their concerning online experiences to us or to our attention if they're worried that they're going to get in trouble for being online in the first place, right? We know that scare tactics really don't work. Adolescents in particular, right, developmentally, they are inclined to believe that they're always going to be the exception to the rule, right? Whatever it is, it's never going to happen to me, right? So those scare tactics aren't necessarily going to be effective. Um, and really, we need to accept that technology is important to the child we're working with. The role that tech plays in our kids' lives can be hard to understand for those of us who had even a relatively tech-free childhood, right? But there are a lot of positive ways that technology can be harnessed, and tech is going to be inevitably part of their lives. So our goal really is to make them informed consumers of an online world.
Thanks, Ashley. So, Diana, through your research and the surveys you've conducted, can you kind of walk us through another scenario of what digital safety planning could look like?
Sure, absolutely. So let's look at this case study. A 15-year-old begins to post about issues with friends um, at school and shares updates on TikTok. She uses the same name across social media and links other accounts in her bio. She notices a quick ad suggestion on Snapchat and accepts an account that appears to share several of her interests and lists a nearby school in its bio. The new contact quickly mirrors her language and hobbies, sends a flattering photo to increase credibility. Over a few weeks, the tone shifts from friendly to intimate. The contact repeatedly asks for a private photo and emphasizes secrecy. Don't tell anyone, it's just between us. Feeling pressured and wanting to keep the friendship, she sends a nude image. Almost immediately, the relationship changes, and more images are requested with explicit threats to expose the photo to classmates if she refuses. She's afraid to tell her parents as she will lose her phone, and she decides to meet with the school counselor and hints that she might have a friend in trouble. Next slide. And the reason that I'm using this scenario sort of from the perspective of a friend is because that's what we've seen a bit in research where someone would present that in that manner. And so what I want to do now is just look at, how to take a digital history a little bit to understand what's happening as someone's telling a story. And so looking at a Technograph worksheet that we'll look at, the purpose of the worksheet that I'm going to share is to visualize the relationships between the adolescent's devices, accounts on social media and other platforms, and people who may have access to the accounts. We've heard a lot about the ecosystem, different people that the children might interact with in the real world versus online. And in the end, the goal is to help identify risks and or harms that may exist for the adolescent. And so we're going to just walk through asking the adolescent about what devices they have, note the owner and use. We're just trying to understand a little bit about the relationships online and what accounts they have across platforms and who the relationships they have these conversations with. So really looking at all the possibilities here. And then to create an atmosphere where the adolescent can utilize their right to self-determination and agency and to stay engaged and present while trying to understand this digital mapping. Next slide. And so looking at this worksheet, what we found in research is that quite often when someone's trying to tell a story about what happened on what platform and what device, it becomes very complicated because people have many devices and many people have access. Sometimes it's because somebody else created the account for them or they've shared it with friends or family. And so just having this kind of what we call like a technograph worksheet can be very helpful in terms of understanding who owns an account, what devices are shared. It's in my research, it's very common to find that young people have shared their passwords with others, sometimes consensually, sometimes not, but just kind of understanding the whole landscape so that you can begin to understand what digital steps you need to take. And to that point, there are specific things that one might do for safety planning as we understand this. You want to identify a trusted contact with the youth, like a name, a role, a phone number, and collaborate with the youth to develop immediate steps. And in a digital world, what we want to think about is safety. Is it safe to stop responding, to block a report? Have screenshots been taken that not on the child's device, but on a secondary device? And is there any technical remediation, changing passwords, enabling two-factor authentication? And when doing these things, timing is important. We need to think about what will the person of concern know if a change in technology is made by the youth, such as logging out the abuser on an account or making accounts private and or blocking. For example, will this change result in escalation? So it's very important to make sure that the child and those around the child feel that it is safe to make those changes at that point in time and that proper documentation has occurred before any types of accounts are deleted. And then discuss a reporting plan. Does the platform have to know? A hotline, police, child protection if required? and also recognizing that there's very close follow-up. So if this conversation is starting, it's not a one-off, that there's conversation the next day, 2 weeks, 6 weeks, because these things take a very long time. And so thinking about it in terms of this type of digital context while working with counselors and others.
Thank you, Diana. Hearing from you about the importance of this mapping exercise also makes it so, reminds us of how complex digital lives are now compared to 15 years ago. And it's not just a matter of just shutting one or two accounts off. And then thank you for the reminder of before potentially closing or stopping access, that there may be information to be downloaded or screenshotted for other investigatory purposes. But that segues into the final question of our webinar of, like, as a parent, if this issue seems so overwhelming, I'm sure for behavioral health providers on this call, for clinicians, it's a lot to figure out. How do I, as an individual, have a positive impact in trying to prevent this and respond to this? And so that brings us to the multidisciplinary nature of how really it takes all of us, and we all wear multiple hats and roles. But Ashley, I wanted to start off this final question with you of what else should participants on this webinar be mindful of how behavioral health providers can effectively work with any number of these other roles that we as adults have in the lives of children. Uh, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, sure. So I think a couple of just more things to lift up. One being that with a lot of types of trauma, tech facilitated abuse can make it hard for kids to feel like it's comfortable or safe to navigate future relationships, whether that's in person or online. So working with young survivors to help them sort of rebuild a sense of trust in their own instincts, to recognize what are green flags, what are red flags, and to release some of what they might be experiencing as blame of themselves. Are all ways that we can help set them up for healthy connection in the future. Providing them with a space to practice how to engage with online platforms in safe and age-appropriate ways is going to be essential, because we know that tech will continue to be a significant part of their lives. It's pretty normalized for adults to meet friends or romantic partners online on a dating app, right? Or use ride-sharing apps where you're essentially getting a ride from a stranger, right? And these are going to be situations that our kids are inevitably going to find themselves in. And so we want to help them establish a renewed sense of how to live online safely. And finally, I think that a specific challenge for survivors of tech facilitated abuse is just sitting with the possibility that there may be images or videos of them online that they won't be able to get taken down. That even with increasingly sophisticated means for having those images removed, young survivors know there's a chance that someone saved these images, or that they might pop back up again in sometime in the future. And so it's easy to remain in a state of alert around that knowledge, and important for us to both validate those concerns are real and also provide with strategies for managing that fear without letting it take over.
Thanks, Ashley. And then Morgan, any final thoughts on your end?
Yeah, I mean, just reiterating once again that tech abuse is a complex social and public health issue that requires a multidisciplinary response for us to address. Expanding and improving education on tech abuse within your communities is crucial to help prevent, spot, and respond to victimization more efficiently. This can include engaging local law enforcement, schools, connections through sports like coaches and trainers, academic tutors, music and arts programs. But beyond engaging and educating other adults, we also need to remember that peers are a very important influencer for youth. So figuring out ways to engage youth in your communities and their peers as part of the problem solving component is crucial. Enhancing digital literacy and safety starts with youth sharing with us how they are using technology and relying on their voices to understand what works and what doesn't work in enhancing their own safety. So, finding out what are the conversations that youth are having with each other? How do we motivate youth to speak up and feel comfortable using assertive communication? How do we as adults give them the knowledge and language to help them navigate these conversations and support their peers. Information is more trusted by youth when it comes from a legit source, as they would call it. And so young people really should be seen as our greatest resource with this issue. I also just want to close by saying that it's important to map out resources in your local area or beyond that could become relevant for clients. So, talking with local violence or youth agencies about specialized resources, or creating your own, support groups for things like tech abuse. Trying to find trustworthy cybersecurity experts who can answer some of those more technical questions that Diana was talking through. And then always having in your back pocket national resources that are available for things like non-consensual explicit image distribution or human trafficking resources. I'll leave it with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I think as we've been going through this discussion today, kind of one running assumption is that person on the other end of the screen is a human being. And then in recent weeks, here within HHS, we've been learning more about sometimes it may just not even be a person. It may be a chatbot or a character AI or other AI facilitated entity engaging with that young child, which then further complicates what all the issues that we're talking about. With that, and before I turn it over to our senior advisor, Kevin Malone, soon, just thank you so much, Ashley, Dr. Kanish, Dr. Free, Dr. Pettyjohn, for bringing your expertise, the professional experiences you've had in clinical settings and working with young people. It is very clear to us that this is one of many conversations we need to have and bring in not just the behavioral health providers, but many other stakeholders. So in the coming months, please anticipate more from us and truly value that you have, we've benefited from the experiences, the research, and the community relationships that you bring into this space. So Kevin, at this point, I will turn to you to close out from our end at HHS, and then our NITAC colleague will do the final logistical closing.
Thank you once again for joining us today. We've heard powerful perspectives on how technology facilitated abuse is affecting young people in our communities. What is clear is that the behavioral health consequences run deep. Children and youth are left grappling with anxiety, depression, trauma, and isolation, which impacts that can shape their lives for years to come. Parents and educators may not know where to turn for help. A few key themes stand out from today's conversation. Awareness and recognition are essential. Technology facilitated abuse often goes unseen or is misunderstood. By asking the right questions and creating supportive environments, we can help young people feel safe enough to come forward. The impact is significant and lasting. This form of abuse undermines trust, erodes a sense of safety, and can have grave effects on mental health. Survivors deserve care that is trauma-informed and responsive to their unique needs. Parents, caregivers, schools, and the broader community also need support, as the harms of this type of abuse has broader ripple effects. Collaboration is the way forward. As we close, I encourage you to consider how today's discussion can inform your own practice, and please help spread the word. Thank you again for your dedication to this issue. With care, compassion, and collaboration, we can better protect our children and youth and ensure that they have supports that they need to heal and thrive. And I personally am going to pray to God that He will intervene and provide guidance and protection for all youth dealing with this evil and all those youth that are at risk. God, please help us. Thank you all for today. I learned a lot, and I'm grateful for everyone that was on this webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone for joining. We're going to put up another poll. Please give us some more data before you depart from us today. We'll put the poll up if you want to answer a few questions about the webinar today. And then we also, once you complete the poll, we've got a QR code that will get you to an evaluation if you've got other ideas, other topics that you'd like to see, other skills that you'd like to have in future sessions, please give us your insights so that we can plan accordingly. Again, thank you again for your support today and for participating.